everyone. All right, and then if you admit all, perfect. And I've got a couple of words of introduction. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us in person and online. So this is one of our hybrid programs. And it is being recorded. So this will be available on probably our YouTube and social medias. So if you want to share it or rewatch it, please do. You'll get a message about that. As I said, it is being recorded. And welcome to the evening. So I am Kat White. I am Director of Historic Collections here at the Stowe Center for Literary Activism, where we seek to encourage social justice and literary activism by exploring the life and legacy of Harriet Beecher Stowe and all who advocate hope and freedom then and now. And we think deeply about the life and the legacy of Harriet Beecher Stowe here. We think about who she was as a writer and a person, who her contemporaries were, that her work was interacting with and responding to. And we think about why all of this matters to us today. So it's with these questions in mind that we put together this Who is Harriet series to explore the past as we understand it today. I'm very pleased to have with us this evening Dr. Tracey Hucks. Dr. Hucks is a nationally known and esteemed scholar of Africana studies and American religious history. Dr. Hucks is the Victor S. Thomas Professor of Africana Religious Studies at Harvard Divinity School and the Suzanne Young Murray Professor for Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. She has served recently as Provost and Dean at the faculty at Colgate University, where she has been Professor of Religion and Africana and Latin American Studies. Dr. Hucks previously taught at Davidson College and Haverford College. And in 1995, she was a resident graduate scholar at Obafemi Awolowo University in Nigeria. A graduate of Colgate University, she earned her AM and PhD from Harvard University in 1998. Huck's most recent publication is Obeah, Orisa, and Religious Identity in Trinidad, Volume 1, Africans in the White Colonial Imagination, which was published in October 2022 by Duke University Press, and which is available from Riverbend Books this evening at a discounted price for participants here. Working with Diane Stewart, Dr. Diane Stewart, who authored Volume 2, this 2-volume study theorizes the prominent role of Africana religious cultures in the shaping of diaspora identities. Right now, I am very happy to present to you Dr. Tracey Hucks.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out in this weather. We appreciate that. I want to thank the Executive Director, Karen Fisk, the Director of Historic Collections, Kat White, and the staff for the invitation to return to the Stowe Center for Literary Activism to participate in the Who is Harriet series. And also, as a former Dean and Provost, I also know the importance of thanking the donors who have supported the series and the rich programming made available to the public. Thank you. And finally, I want to thank the audience here in person and those who are joining via live stream. Close to 25 years ago, I committed myself to including Uncle Tom's Cabin into my teaching corpus so that students will be familiar with this international classic in American religious history. I felt the need to do so even more when I joined the faculty at Harvard University in 2022, This was a place where, as a student, I first read Uncle Tom's Cabin in its entirety in a course led by the renowned scholar of Puritanism and American religion, David D. Hall. Because at Harvard Divinity School, we confer the degrees of Master of Theological Studies, Master of Theology, Master of Divinity, Master of Religion and Public Life, and PhD through the Committee on the Study of Religion. I thought it was essential that students read Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin because of its vast sales and readership in the 19th century, second only to the Christian Bible. Few texts in history can boast being translated into 37 languages within the first 2 years of publication. Close to 60 languages total, and a historical resonance in image, stage, and American popular culture across a century. I currently teach a course entitled Uncle Tom's Cabin and its Diaspora, which highlights both its national and international notoriety, as well as offers a window into slavery, evangelicalism, religion and social reform, romantic racialism, race and representation, gendered authority, domesticity, and American regionalism. I also come across, because of the vastness of Uncle Tom's Cabin, when I was doing my research and archival work in Trinidad, there was Harriet Beecher Stowe being influenced by an Irish woman whose family owned a plantation in Trinidad. I write about this in Obeah, Orisa, Religious Identity in Trinidad. So it is 1854. She sees that Harriet Beecher Stowe is being able to become independent in terms of the wealth. This woman, Fanny Wilkins, her husband is suffering with mental illness, and so she's becoming destitute. Slavery is already over in Trinidad from 1838. It's 1854. She writes a novel called The Slave Son, where she recreates, she's inspired. She puts in the very beginning, I'm inspired by Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. And so she recreates this entire plantation life in Trinidad long after actually emancipation has come. And in many ways, for her to see some of the few ways that women could be economically and financially independent. And so I write a bit about that in my text. Some 173 years later after the publication, 173 years after its publication, Uncle Tom's Cabin remains a classic in American literature, albeit a classic that is admittedly controversial, contested, and conflicted in its legacy. It was no less so when it was published in the mid-19th century in the worlds of the prominent African-American leaders, Frederick Douglass and Martin Delany. When I teach Frederick Douglass and Martin Delany in my Stowe course, I transform my students into a leadership forum where they must become a think tank for helping to resolve the challenges faced by African Americans during the time of Douglass and Delany. And that's difficult for them to do, for them to say, this is the situation you're in, and tell me what would have been the way and the direction to go in that context. I asked them to transport themselves into the worlds of Douglass and Delany in 1852, where the 1850 census had just revealed that there were 434,495 free Blacks in the United States versus 3,204,313 persons who were enslaved, where only 58% of all free Blacks could read compared to close to a 90% white literacy rate at that time, where 78% of Northern free Blacks and 83% of Southern free Blacks owned no property, where they were prohibited access to the vote, and with the Fugitive Slave Act recently being passed, free Blacks such as Frederick Douglass and Martin Delany were at the risk of being enslaved and re-enslaved in the South. Into this context, I asked my students, and I ask you, to determine the best course of strategic action on behalf of an enslaved population that would rise to 4 million just 8 years after the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin. This is the contextual crossroads of debate where Frederick Douglass and Martin Delany found themselves in the 1850s as leading figures in the African American community. Frederick Douglass had been a free man for only 14 years when Uncle Tom's Cabin was published. He had escaped from slavery in Maryland to New York on September 3rd, 1838. He was born into slavery approximately 1818 and lived throughout most of the 19th century and dies in 1895. His expansive career included abolitionist, political orator and activist, Union Army recruiter, suffragist, secretary of Santo Domingo Commission, a recorder of deeds, and U.S. Minister to Haiti, just to name some. Martin Delany was born to a free mother and enslaved father in 1812, was an abolitionist, a physician, and one of the first African Americans admitted to the Harvard Medical School, and was eventually forced to leave due to white protests. He was a commissioned officer and author from 1847 to 1849. He was the co-editor of the North Star newspaper with Frederick Douglass, was a Freedmen's Bureau officer, and later ran unsuccessfully for political office. This evening, I want to gain access and have as my beginning point to be one that is growing increasingly challenging in our current national climate. I want to begin a lecture on debate and disagreement for what I try to teach my students from the places of commonality first. Those shared views that Harriet Beecher Stowe, Frederick Douglass, and Martin Delany collectively held. In this space of commonality, I wanted to begin by saying they each held that slavery was a dehumanizing and social evil, that the abolition of slavery was a necessary moral imperative, that slavery destroyed the fabric of all families, and that the millions of enslaved African-descended persons had a moral and human right to freedom. They didn't disagree on that. Also, given the international literary achievement of Uncle Tom's Cabin and the global movement of its author to England, to Scotland, to France, to Italy, scholars argue that Stowe became, quote, the most internationally visible American writer of her time, thus arguing for a reading of, quote, Stowe as a transatlantic writer, the transatlantic Stowe, as the works of Cone and Muir and Todd suggest. Yet similarly, in many ways, the three figures, Stowe, Douglass, and Delany, each share a surprisingly commonality of global travel movement beyond the national borders of antebellum America, with Douglass preceding Stowe in his European travels to England, Scotland, and Ireland, and later in his life to France. He travels to France, to Italy, to Greece, to Egypt, the Dominican Republic, and Haiti. In his New York Times bestseller novel, Colin McCann, has anyone ever read Transatlantic? I recommend it. He labels Douglass too as a transatlantic, providing fictional insight into the possible ruminations of Douglass as he traveled to Ireland, still legally an American fugitive slave. In one of these moments of inner reflections in the novel, McCann offered the following through the Frederick Douglass character. This is Frederick Douglass speaking. The simple way to see it was that the British were Protestant, the Irish were Catholic. One ruled, the other lay underfoot. The Irish were poor, but not enslaved. According to Douglass, he said he was still a slave, fugitive. If he returned to Boston, he could be kidnapped at any time, taken south, wrapped to a tree, whipped. His owners, they would make a spectacle of his fame. He had been given a chance to speak out against what had held him in chains, and he would continue to do so until the links lay in pieces at his feet. He thought he knew now what had brought him here to Ireland, the chance to explore what it feels like to be free and captive at the same time. It was something even the most aggrieved Irishmen could not understand. To be in bondage to everything, even the idea of one's own peace. His body, Douglass says, his mind, his soul, had for years served only for the profit of others. He continued, he had his own people to whom he was pledged, 3 million. They were the currency of his freedom. What weight would he be able to carry to support the Irish too? Their agonies, their ambiguities. He had enough of his own, he reflected. Martin Delany too traversed the Atlantic world, traveling to West Africa, Central America, and the Caribbean in search of a new independent settlement for African Americans, even establishing a preliminary agreement with the Yoruba chieftaincy in Obeah, Nigeria. Especially for Douglass and Delany, these transatlantic travels greatly impacted their visions of Black freedom and who would be designated its greatest proponents and allies, and who would be seen to pose obstacles and impediments. Within this transatlantic context, Harriet Beecher Stowe and Uncle Tom's Cabin stood at the core of the Douglass-Delany debate, which was largely played out in public in a series of published correspondence. According to literary scholar Robert Levine, quote, addressing issues of cross-racial sympathy, anti-slavery leadership, Black violence, and African colonization, the Delany-Douglass debate on Uncle Tom's Cabin helped to set the terms of the Black debate on the novel for decades to come. Delany and Douglass's African-American contemporaries remarked openly about the potential impact and influence of the fictional novel on the real lives of African Americans in antebellum America. In fact, according to literary scholar Marva Banks, when Uncle Tom's Cabin was published in book form, over 200 articles containing comments by Black readers appeared in the antebellum press. Like Delany and Douglass, the reactions of this wider Black readership were undoubtedly mixed. For some, the novel was deemed a success, inimitably beautiful and truthful. Quote, Uncle Tom's Cabin may be charged with helping the Underground Railroad, with the famous William Wells Brown proclaiming that Uncle Tom's Cabin has come down like a morning sunlight, unfolding all eyes upon the peculiar institution and awakening sympathy in hearts that never felt for the slaves. However, several Black readers also challenged Stowe, stating Uncle Tom's Cabin was a good old soul, thoroughly and perfectly pious. Indeed, if any men had too much piety, Uncle Tom is that man. And printed in Douglass's paper was a prominent leader, George T. Downing, who wrote, quote, he preferred George Harris because he was the only one that really betrays any other than the subservient, submissive Uncle Tom spirit, which has been the cause of so much disrespect felt for the colored man. Similarly, and most emphatically, one Black reader strongly rebuked the final outcomes that Stowe's characters face, questioning, quote, Uncle Tom must be killed, George Harris exiled, heaven for dead Negroes, Liberia for living mulattoes, neither can live on the American continent, death or banishment is our doom, say the slave owners, the colonists, and save the mark, Mrs. Stowe. It's important to frame the Douglass-Delany debate within the context of this larger set of antebellum Blacks, as both leaders share key features and aspects of their contemporary views. However, one evident starting point of this debate between Douglass and Delany rests not in their disagreements on Stowe and Uncle Tom's Cabin, but in Delany's initial allegation that Douglass eclipsed the importance of his book, The Condition, Elevation, Immigration, and Destiny of the Colored People of the United States, Politically Considered, published in the same year as Uncle Tom's Cabin. According to Banks, as early as April 8, 1852, less than a month after the book's publication, Frederick Douglass eagerly announced in his paper quote, Uncle Tom's Cabin, the thrilling story from the pen of Mrs. Stowe, would soon be on sale. However, to the silence of his own published book in the same year, Delany writes in July of 1852, stating, this work, and he's reading his own book, a copy of which I sent you in May on its issue, has never been noticed in the columns of your paper. This silence and neglect on your part was unjustifiable, because in noticing it, it was not necessary that you should implicate yourself either with the errors or sentiments thereon contained. You could have given it a circulating notice by saying such a book had been written by me, saying anything else about or against it if you pleased, and let those who read it pass their own opinions. But you heaped upon it a cold and deathly silence. This is not the course you pursue towards any issue, good or bad, sent you by white persons. You have always given them some notice. So Delany was feeling some shade, as the young people would say, in the same 1852 year. In subsequent communications, Delany would make direct mention of Douglass having visited Harriet Beecher Stowe, and by Douglass's own public admission, having consulted her on, quote, as to some method which should contribute successfully and permanently to the improvement and elevation of the free people of color of the United States. Delany, in his March 1853 letter, strongly critiques Douglass' position to seek white allyship, stating, quote, now I simply wish to say that we have always fallen into great errors in efforts of this kind, going to others than the intelligent and experienced among ourselves. And in all due respect and deference to Mrs. Stowe, I beg leave to say that she knows nothing about us. The free colored people of the United States, neither does any other white person, and consequently can contrive no successful scheme for our elevation. It must be done by ourselves. Delany, in the publication of his The Condition, Elevation, Immigration, and Destiny of the Colored People of the United States, is considered one of the early progenitors of Black nationalism and the vision of an independent Black nation for Blacks without white influence and oversight. Disagreeing on several points, Douglass thought it unwise and ill-considered, quote, to scornfully reject all aid from our white friends and to denounce them as unworthy of our confidence. Douglass continues, Brother Delany has worked long and hard. He has written vigorously and spoken eloquently to colored people, beseeching them in the name of liberty and all the dearest interests of humanity to unite their energies and to increase their activities in the work of their own elevation. Yet, where has his voice been heeded? And where is his practical result? Echo answers, where? Is not the field open? Why then should any man object to the efforts of Mrs. Stowe or anyone else who is moved to do something on our behalf? The assertion that Mrs. Stowe, quote, knows nothing about us shows that Brother Delany knows nothing about Mrs. Stowe, but he certainly would not so violate his moral or common sense if he did. And this is all being played out in public newspapers, letters. Yet Delany does not concede, but instead shifts to the subject of Stowe's royalties, and arguing that given the fact that Stowe admits that Josiah Henson is the real Uncle Tom, since Mrs. Stowe and Mrs. Jewett and co-publishers have realized so great an amount of money from the sale of a work founded upon this good man, would it be expecting too much to suggest that they present Father Henson with a portion of the profits? He accuses Stowe of taking, quote, the best fugitive slave narratives that are then, quote, clothed in Mrs. Stowe's own language. Delany reproaches Stowe for what he perceives as a paternalistic approach whereby no enterprise, institution, or anything else should be commenced for us, he says, or our general benefit without first consulting us. Other than this, he says, is treating us as slaves and presuming us all to be ignorant and incapable of knowing our wants. In defense of Stowe, Douglass in reproach states, quote, it is uncalled for because there's nothing in the position of Mrs. Stowe which should awaken against her a single suspicion of unfriendliness towards the free colored people in the United States. But on the contrary, there is much in it to inspire confidence in her friendship. Whoever will bring a straw's weight of influence to break the chains of our brother bondsmen, or whisper one word of encouragement and sympathy to our prescribed race in the North, shall be welcomed by us to that philanthropic field of labor. Douglass concludes, we believe that lady to be but at the beginning of her labors for the colored people of this country. Reciprocally, in her public communication and publication, Stowe possessed a deep respect and admiration for Frederick Douglass, so much so that when she published her, quote, Men of Our Times, or Leading Patriots of the Day, being narratives of the lives and deeds of statesmen, generals, and orators, Frederick Douglass was included in the volume and held in high regard. For Stowe, Douglass was the man who fought his way up from a nameless hovel on a Maryland plantation. And quote, from this position, he has raised himself to the habits of mind, thought, and life of a cultivated gentleman, and from that point of sight has illustrated exactly what slavery was. Thank God we write in the past tense what slavery was. According to Stowe, Douglass, quote, succeeded in rearing an intelligent and cultivated family and in placing himself in the front rank among intelligent and cultivated men. Few orators, she says, among us surpass him. What I found most intriguing about Stowe's portrayal of Douglass in this text is how she emphasizes his biracial identity, indicating the father of Frederick Douglass was a white man who he never knew. It would have been of no advantage to him to know him. And instead, still makes a gendered and racial shift, attributing Douglass's evidence of, quote, wonderful character and intelligence to his mother, Harriet Bailey. According to Stowe, we have supposed that the mother of Douglass must have been one of that Mandingo tribe of Africans, who was distinguished upon the slaves for fine features, great energy, intellect, and pride of character. But there is reason to think that those fine intellectual gifts, that love of liberty and hatred of slavery, which have led him to the position he now occupies among freemen, were due to the blood of his mother. That silent, noble Black woman whose wrongs were borne in such patience, whose soul must so often have burned within her, whose affections were stronger than weariness, and whose mind would possess the key of knowledge, even though she gained it at such terrible sacrifices and hazards. She is to be honored as having lived in her son and being the true author and inspirer of all that is good and just in him. And says this, for those of you who read the narrative, you know that Frederick Douglass, his mother lived maybe about 12 miles away from him on a different plantation. He may have seen her maybe 4 or 5 times in his entire life and believed that she's dead by the time he's 7 years old. Thus, given that limited contact, Stowe concludes, it may have been inspired by the invisible guardianship of that poor mother, who, unable to help him in life, may have permitted higher powers in the world of the spirits. So Stowe alludes to the combination of bloodline, Douglass's mother's ability to navigate superhuman difficulties in life, and her ancestral presence among him after her death were the source of, quote, the manifest talents he possessed. Nevertheless, the relationship between Stowe and Douglass was not one without staunch disagreements. Stowe writes Douglass in 1851, while still publishing Uncle Tom's Cabin in serial form, to not simply inquire about those she might interview firsthand on their experiences on slave plantations, but more acutely to counter Douglass's views she had been reading in the newspaper, his views on the Christian church as a pro-slavery institution, and his views against African colonization and the removal of African Americans from the United States. So she's writing to counter him and to persuade him otherwise. In her correspondence to Douglass, she writes, quote, "I have noticed with regret your sentiments on two subjects, the church and African colonization. With regret, because I think you have a considerable share of reason for your feelings on both those subjects. But I would willingly, if I could, modify your views on both points." Stowe establishes her authority on the church, indicating in the letter, "I am a minister's daughter and a minister's wife, and I've had 6 brothers in the ministry. One is in heaven. I certainly ought to know something of the feelings of ministers on this subject." And she goes on to say, "As for myself and my husband, we have for the last 17 years lived on the border of a slave state, and we have never shrunk from the fugitives, and we have helped them with all we have to give. I have received the children of liberated slaves into a family school and taught them with my own children, and it has been the influence that we found in the church and by the altar that has made us do all this." She seeks to correct Douglass by saying, "After all, my brother, the strength and hope of your oppressed race does lie in the church, in hearts united to him of whom it is said, he shall spare the souls of the needy, and precious shall their blood be in his sight. Everything is against you, but Jesus Christ is for you, and he has not forgotten his church, misguided and erring though it might be. I have looked all the field over with despairing eyes. I see no hope but in him. This movement must and will become a purely religious one. The light will spread in churches. The tone of feeling will rise. Christians north and south will give up all connections with and take up their testimony against slavery, and thus the work will be done," she says. We know, however, that Douglass is never convinced of Stowe's views on the church and African colonization. Just 4 months after Uncle Tom's Cabin is published, Douglass gives his famous speech, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July?" In July 1852, outraged by the passing of the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law in an alleged Christian nation, Douglass scathingly declares, quote, "There is not a nation on the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of these United States at this very hour. Go where you may, search where you will, roam all the monarchies and despotisms of the whole world, travel through South America, search out every abuse, and when you have found the last one, lay your facts by the side of the everyday practices of this nation, and you will say with me that for revolting barbarity and shameless hypocrisy, America reigns without a rival." He argues for the simplicity of the Christian church as he exhorts to his audience, "I take this law to be one of the grossest infringements of Christian liberty," and this is the Fugitive Slave Act. "And if Christians and ministers of our country were not stupidly blind or most wickedly indifferent, they too would so regard it. The fact that the church of our country, with fractional exceptions, does not esteem the Fugitive Slave Law as a declaration of war against religious liberty implies that the church regards religion simply as a form of worship, an empty ceremony, and not a vital principle requiring active benevolence, justice, love, and goodwill towards men. It esteems sacrifice above mercy, psalm singing above doing right, solemn meetings above practical righteousness, a worship that can be conducted by persons who refuse to give shelter to the houseless, to give bread to the hungry, clothing to the naked, and who enjoin obedience to a law forbidding those acts of mercy is a curse, not a blessing to mankind. In harsh indictment, Douglass goes on to state, but the church of this country is not only indifferent to the wrongs of the slave, it actually takes sides with the oppressors. It has made itself the bulwark of American slavery and the shields of American slave hunters. Many of its most eloquent divines who stand as the very lights of the church have shamelessly given the sanction of religion and the Bible to the whole slave system. They have taught that man may properly be a slave, that the relation of master and slave is ordained by God, that to send back an escaped bondsman to his master is clearly the duty of all the followers of the Lord Jesus Christ. And this horrible blasphemy is palmed off upon the world for Christianity. For my part, I would say, welcome infidelity, welcome atheism, welcome anything in preference to the gospel as preached by these divines. Moreover, although the role of the Christian church and slavery was a highly contested matter throughout the country, the issue of African colonization was perhaps the most contentious and immensely debated issue facing antebellum Black communities in Douglass and Delany. Many African American readers reached the end of Uncle Tom's Cabin with Stowe's ultimate solution is to have George and Eliza leave the United States and go to Africa, and they found themselves vehemently opposed to this. They saw resonance of Thomas Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia, where Jefferson stated, quote, "I am prepared and ready now to give my voice unhesitantly in favor of any feasible plan to send every Negro far away from our land with all possible dispatch. This must be done in the spirit of kindness and Christian philanthropy towards the Blacks and from the pressing motive of self-preservation on the parts of whites," says Jefferson. Thus, the end of the novel was met with strong reaction from some African Americans remarking, quote, "Talk not to me of colonization, for I'm a free man of this native land. This is the land which gave us birth, our fathers' graves, our freedom's earth." Or that of William Allen, who writes, quote, "I have one regret with regard to the book, and that is that the chapter favoring colonization was ever written." And most directly from an African-American minister who a year after his publication observed, quote, "A sentiment is now developing itself with certain and accelerated growth that has for its object the ultimate removal of the colored people from the northern states to the shores of Africa. It will not be traveling far out of the record to say Uncle Tom's Cabin comes in for a large share in the growth of this sentiment. For clarity and distinction, Martin Delany in his public discourse believed in voluntary immigration and espoused Black nationalist principles of sovereignty, self-determination, and economic self-sufficiency, Black immigration and autonomous self-government in Africa. But he staunchly opposed and wanted to be distinguished from the American Colonization Society of 1816 and what he understood as the forced removal of free African Americans to live as colonized American subjects in Liberia, far removed from the millions who would remain enslaved in America. In his own words, Frederick Douglass believed, however, quote, "Colonization has taught the nation that we are low, ignorant, and besotted, that our elevation in this country is impossible, that Africa and not America is our country," adding that for more than 200 years, we have been the constant companion of the white man and the joint possessors with him of this country. Douglass remained unmoved by Stowe's gestures toward departure and colonization, with Douglass categorically stating, quote, "Our minds are made up to live here if we can, or die here if we must. So every attempt to remove us will be, as it ought to be, labor lost. Here we are, and here we shall remain. In the end, history bears witness to Frederick Douglass's position, since for the most part, the nearly 4 million enslaved and 400,000 free African Americans remained in the United States. Inevitably, the Civil War would begin. Frederick Douglass would become an active recruiter of Black troops, would meet with President Abraham Lincoln 3 times during the Civil War, and Douglass's sons, Lewis and Charles, would become some of the earliest African Americans to enlist and serve and become sergeants in the Union Army. We know from history that Stowe would visit President Abraham Lincoln in the White House in 1862 to express her support for emancipation, and Martin Delany would serve in the Army during the Civil War. He would become a recruiter also, an advocate for Black leadership of Black regiments, and President Lincoln would confer the rank of Major upon Delany, making him the first African American in U.S. history to secure this commission in 1865. In closing, Douglass and Delany and Stowe never reach a full strategic consensus or a unified vision on determining the best course of action in antebellum America. I often wonder how we would have fared at that time in their positions with a compounding sense of urgency, working on behalf of so many millions. Yet, despite their disagreements, their public debates, letters, books, writings, and political and social advocacy leave a collective legacy of commitment, courage, vision, determination to what Frederick Douglass understood as a sacred cause on behalf of the enslaved and on behalf of the nation. In a 2018 article entitled Frederick Douglass's Feud Over Uncle Tom's Cabin, the author concluded that these historical public figures, Stowe, Delany, Douglass, represented a time in history when, quote, differences could be fully articulated. When one like Douglass and Delany could embody, quote, a strategic humanism as they debate. And through tense exchanges, there still remained, quote, a powerful demonstration of the possibility of dialogue. May we learn from their legacy today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hucks. That was phenomenal. I think we have time for some Q&A, and if you're joining us online, please feel free to pop some questions in the chat and we can read those aloud.
Thank you all.
I just have, what was the age difference between the two men?
One was born in 1812 and the other one in 1818.
Okay.
So not that big of a difference,
And
but life difference because, you know, Delany was born, his father was enslaved and his mother was free, and legally he followed the condition of his mother. So
where was Delany born?
in Virginia.
Okay.
So,
I can't remember if you mentioned this. Did Delany acquire any education, like formal education at all?
yes, he gets admitted into Harvard Medical School.
Okay. Oh, that's right.
And so it was he and about, I think, 3 other who were going to be the first African Americans to integrate that. They were admitted, they actually began to matriculate, and their white classmates, you know, protested so vehemently that they had to leave. And so he continues on, you know, becomes a physician, actually helps in one of the cholera epidemics. So he does. Yes.
In other countries here in what we call the Americas, and the Caribbean, were there actually more active recolonization efforts among those Africans that were slaves in those countries? Or was this somewhat unique to the US?
It was somewhat unique to the US. And because of the kind of slavery that we had here. And so in the Caribbean, many of the owners and masters didn't live there. I mean, it was largely an absentee kind of plantation. They were back in the mainland Europe, and they had hired overseers to come and the population. So in Trinidad, the population there may have been at the height of Trinidad's slavery, could have been like maybe 3,000 white people there, and about 25,000 to almost 30,000 enslaved Africans. So it's very, very, very different. And and also after particularly the British emancipate slavery in 1838, they began to, and you may know this, the slave trade closes in 1807. They began to police the waters of the Atlantic. And because the Spanish and the Portuguese particularly are still engaging in direct importation in Africa. And so they are actually rescuing these Africans from slave ships, bringing them to Sierra Leone, which was their colony, and then transporting them as free labor into the Caribbean colonies. So you get they were called like the liberated Africans. Right. And so you begin to see that kind of a different kind of movement in the Caribbean than you see. Now, you know, in the US, I mean, in part, I read only part of Frederick Thomas Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia. I mean, he goes on and it's very clear that there needs to be a separation of the races. That if for some reason slavery were to end, you know, he says we have to move these Africans out of the country because he said that whites will be so upset that slavery is over, and the enslaved people will be so upset because of the brutality that was them, that he believed in the end that it would end in his language, the extermination of one race over another. So this wasn't just a light kind of suggestion. This was a real, you know, when he's writing in 1787, this is something he really believes in will have to happen in order to preserve what he's seeing as the American Republic. Thank you for that question.
Didn't that somewhat continue to happen after the emancipation?
Did what continue to happen?
Yeah, that the antagonism between whites and now freed Africans, freed blacks.
Yes.
You know, in some sense, it was really behind closed doors. It was financed largely by industry.
And I would say, man, it wasn't as much even behind closed doors, because after the Civil War, you have soldiers who had fought. They're coming back wanting to rebuild. You had the Freedmen's Bureau that's, you know, after slavery trying to do some of this. We have federal troops that are there trying to protect this. And then we get a new administration that comes in and they leave, they take the troops out, and you begin to see, as early as 1880, widespread lynching of African American men. So between 1880 and say 1920, you begin to see a very public spectacle lynching, very violent attack on African American men at that time, and very violent attack on the towns, the Black towns that they're trying to constitute for themselves. So on the one hand, you know, yes, on the one hand, they're saying, okay, if you want us to be in our own spaces, in our own towns, in our own, we'll do that. And whenever they would begin to thrive, you know, you began to see these, you know, widespread attacks on the towns.
That seemed to be the screw that turned after emancipation, was success of blacks, as you know, always thought initially to just be ignorant, you know, not capable of learning, not capable of running their own business. But once they became successful, that argument began to crumble.
Because you have maybe, you know, scholars say about maybe 10% of literacy, you know, after slavery, but African Americans, primarily through churches, begin to open schools and begin to really have all-out education campaign for reading and for writing. In part because there, you know, you hear Frederick Douglass we're gonna remain here. So they want, integration into the country with full rights and benefits that everyone else has.
Can I ask, with the, after the Reconstruction ended and these atrocities were common, did Harriet Beecher Stowe write or say anything about that? I mean, did she respond or react or comment on the way things were going? Do you know?
She did. Now, Kat, I was gonna give a shout out to the conference that you're planning. Because I have this paper, I had to stop because I was gonna give a whole nother part. And I said, no, let me just put that in as a submission. But she does continue to write. She does continue to write about these atrocities also. And what often a kind of silent and invisible friend in the midst of this also is John Brown. I mean, he and Douglass were very close. When Douglass leaves the country, and he's at one point he leaves because the Harper's Ferry raid was unsuccessful, and he thought that he would be implicated also because he was a supporter in that way. So these, those who were working together were in some ways cross-racially in these close-knit spaces. And Stowe and Delany actually meet in England, at an event. Again, not agreeing though. Still, but what I also wanted to, and I'll say this, what I wanted to model was, and I'm trying to model this for my students, is historically, because I added the subtitle up there also about modeling dialogue, like looking at history and modeling dialogue. So they're very careful in their responses. They're reading others, they're responding, and what they're also doing that I didn't have time is that they're conceding the spaces where they do agree. They'll say, well, I agree with you on this point. It's on this point that I disagree. And they're modeling in our nation at a very, very difficult time, at least how to have some kind of dialogue across difference. And I thought that was something that I thought it was timely to raise that.
We have a question from online from Ned Beecher. It seems to me that Delany is less known. Is that an accurate perception? And is there a reason for that? For example, were his arguments less well received by the dominant white culture? Got to scroll down, and historians, implicating that. And how is his legacy reflected in the Black nationalism of the mid-20th century?
That's a great question. It's almost, these different paths begin to develop, and one can look at a history with Delany being like the forerunner of Black nationalism. I mean, he is pointing the nation within a nation. He is really trying to foster what became the Black convention movement and Pan-Africanism. And that is a whole trajectory that I think that he's known in those circles. And that there is, when you look at the kind of historiography of Black nationalism, one always will come back to Delany. But also what never goes away is that what never goes away are a couple things. One, the violence against Black people, which always then brings the question to bear again, should we leave the country? Should we stay? And so this kind of back to Africa piece never really goes away. It continues. You do have some that go back in the late 19th century. You have some African Americans who go back as missionaries, sponsored through some of the Black denominational churches. And the largest Black mass movement in history is the Marcus Garvey movement. It is the largest Black mass movement in history. And it was advocating also for going back to Africa and saying that we won't be able to stay in this space. And so Delany remains in the history, but in another trajectory that kind of is always at this space. Should we stay? Should we separate? Should we go? And I've asked my students, we've had, think tanks, like, what would you have done? What would you have done? you have 3 to 4 million people enslaved. You're free, but your freedom is very tenuous. They just passed an 1850 law. So even if you weren't enslaved, you can still be enslaved and brought back into slavery. You know, you can be like Solomon Northup, you know, others. And what do? Where's your commitment? You know, Delany does move his family to Canada after the fugitive slave law, but he comes back. But he comes back at the end of his life. You know, he's doing work in South Carolina, and so but one is torn because you know Douglas, they felt we can't abandon them, that we cannot abandon these millions, even though we can travel the world and go other places. Where does that commitment lie? But where does the solution lie? And for you know, and you can hear both of their sides. You know, Delany is trying to say, we want to be self-determined. We want to be able to have our destiny in our own hands. Very American also. We want to be, you know, charting our own path of freedom in that, outside of the white gaze and white oversight and any attempts for colonization. We want self-determination. We want liberty. And you have Douglas saying, yes, I agree with that, but we don't want to do that if there are some allies that can help us that might not be within the community or with that time, the colored community there. And so, you know, this is one of those wonderful debates where no one wins. Where, you know, there's no winner in it, but there are great ideas and great thoughts that were brought into it. Including Harriet Beecher Stowe, who creates, I mean, what she does also is that she animates an entire women's readership. And really begins to say that women, you have a part in this. You're not passive, you know, agents in this country, and even in the sense of in the domestic sphere, you have power. Exercise that power. You can change a nation from your home, from your own home, and so that is something that is going. You can influence, you know, the Senator Byrds of the world, and you have that power to do so. The other reason why I would say that I teach the novel is because Uncle Tom's Cabin, it never dies. I mean, they're still here for 170 something plus years, but it lives on. It lives on the stage. It lives in film. It lives in household figurines. It lives in cartoons. I mean, it takes on a life of its own, far beyond what Harriet Beecher Stowe could have ever thought. But it also in some ways gets distorted as well. And so the Uncle Tom trope becomes disconnected from the Uncle Tom we see in the novel. You know, even though it's a very complicated character in that, you know, and one would have wanted to see, you know, others, you know, challenge this, that he was too pious and that he did not fight physically for his liberation. But I also, when my students are reading it, they're surprised to know why he dies. That he gets killed because he's protecting Black women. At the end of that, he will not give up the 2 women who ran away. He will not, he refuses to and gets beaten to death. And that's something not to be, you know, easily put aside in terms of why he becomes this martyr in the text. Yes.
I'm wondering, I'm just feeling there's a power in your statement about that this is a debate that never concludes. Like there's something that they don't ever come to an agreement. And I guess I'm curious about what your students think about that. That this debate never comes to an agreement. And do you think that there's like, is that the most free outcome, that everybody doesn't agree?
I would say it this way, that the conclusion of it is that the problem may be so multifaceted that it needs more than one approach. And so, trying to take time to decide one singular way and one singular path to solve a multidimensional, largely historical, huge problem, may not be the way I want to go. So part of it is not wanting to get them stuck in a singular way of looking at things, but having them believe that they can bring solutions to the table. I mean, one of the assignments that I give them is for their final assignment, they have to rewrite the end of the story. Because I'm trying to get them to be, I tell them, I am not teaching you right now. I'm teaching you for 5, 10 years down the line. I'm teaching you where you're in the public. I'm teaching you when you're in front of the United Nations or Congress or the Senate or a nonprofit or some global entity. That is who I am teaching. And I'm teaching you to have your own mind and vision beyond what is just handed to you. So Stowe gives us a ending to the novel, but it doesn't have to be the ending of the novel since it's still living on as an ancestor among us. So why not continue, to have that be something that they think about until I have them, write different endings to the story.
Sorry, that's a super interesting idea to me. Do you have a favorite alternate ending?
All of my students write wonderful endings.
Fair enough.
They all get great marks. But I challenge them in their creativity.
Yeah.
I challenge them in their creativity. What often becomes some of the endings is staying and doing the literacy work. This understanding that if you had the gift to write and to read in a population that largely did not, that education was one of those ways that you could stay and you could get back. But also, I have students from the continent of Africa who take this course also, who look very differently, at this. Who would look differently at Delany, who's actually going to West Africa to try to negotiate space and really trying to connect in some Pan-African way across the waters, across the Atlantic, and not have this complete severance for eternity. But they're also concerned because they're reading in this with Liberia, this is like 1852, but my African students know that by the 1880s, the Berlin Conference happens and Africa is carved up across, the European colonies. And so they're seeing something in that also, what begins to happen.
Where do you think we are now? Have we made any progress?
Two separate questions. I also teach a course called The Book of Baldwin, James Baldwin and Sacred Text. And on the first day of class, I show, and if you have not seen it, it's on YouTube, the debate between James Baldwin and why am I drawing a blank?
William F. Buckley.
William F. Buckley. The debate between Buckley and the students first, they're at the Cambridge Union, so students first debate the issue, and then Buckley and Baldwin come. It's about an hour long. If you have not seen it, I urge you to see it. And I urge you to see it in this time also, because the students model in there first, a sense of debate, but a listening debate, being able to hear one another. And so do Buckley and Baldwin. I mean, there's a kind of graciousness there, even though they are vehemently disagreeing with one another, but they can hear one another. They're willing to admit when they agree with a particular point. I am searching for that in our current discourse. I'm searching for that. I'm searching for spaces when, and I tell my students, they've heard this, or many of them have heard this over the years, that you have to be willing to be self-reflective. That if you can't be self-reflective and you can't be self-critical, honestly so, then you'll be self-righteous. And I am really training them to come into a nation to open up somebody, to engage in true dialogue. I am trying to get, some of the younger ones not to believe that the only way to engage is through cancel culture. And to not listen and to disregard, to eclipse it. But that if we begin with the commonalities, we want this nation to work. This is where we are. We might come back in another lifetime, it might be someplace else, but this is where we are here. And that we want this American experiment to work. And in order for it to work, we have to start with a commonality that we want it to work. And we can't be so rigid in only seeing one way and how it can work. And we have to be willing to face some of the history that we have, not erase it, not take it down, not close it up, but really face it. I mean, I remember when Denzel Washington won his first Oscar, it was for his role in Glory on the Civil War. And he comes on the Arsenio Hall show. Now, some people may be late, but that was late night. Arsenio Hall. So he goes on the Arsenio Hall show and he's talking about the movie Glory. And I'll never forget this. He says, after the Civil War, the war that killed more people, meaning imploding and killing ourselves than any other war in history. We killed more of each other, of who we are as Americans, than any other war, even world wars. More casualties. And he said after that war, when we had imploded and turned on each other, he said the whole nation needed to go to therapy. And because we did, and we just moved on as though it didn't happen, that we continue to see how trauma reinserts itself across time and across generations. Because we haven't done the hard work for what it means, or what James Baldwin says, we haven't yet paid the price of the ticket for what it means to truly actualize what our constitutional declaration of independence, what that would mean for all of us. And so I quote James Baldwin, I said, I'm in the classroom as a disturber of the peace. But I'm trying to teach them, because at the end, and what I love about James Baldwin is that he is so, he becomes so connected to the philosophy of Piety. But he does, even in his scathing critiques, he says, I love America, and for this reason, I criticize it perpetually. But he does believe in something that is that of called love, and that it could actually happen if we allow ourselves to take off the mask and the false inherited identities that we live in. But that fear keeps us mostly from doing it. So where are we? Have we made progress? Oh, of course. I mean, just even Martin Delany, who could not matriculate at Harvard, and I not only get my PhD from them, but I'm able to be on the faculty. I mean, that is progress. But I don't know. Progress is not always progressive. We may be able to look at these kind of measures but I don't know as a nation, our mentality has evolved to where it can really be. And that takes all of us to do that. What does it mean, to really, really want to have this experiment work? We have what it takes. And I let my students believe we have what it takes to turn it around. And I'm hoping that, from our presidents and administrators, that they would begin to see, widely and to be able to dialogue the way others could 2 centuries ago. Any other questions online? They'll talk to you. No? Well, thank you all. This has been wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You are getting some claps in the chat.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Hucks, so much, and thank you everyone for being here with us today. I hope you can come back and join us on tours for more programs, for more in this series. So as I said, this is part of the Who is Harriet series. Next up will be on November 5th. Dr. Claudia Stokes will be discussing Stowe's feminist theology. Let's see, what else we've got. Yeah, so we do. We're going to be hosting a Stowe symposium in April 18th. It will be held at Trinity College. This is going to be an opportunity to explore, like we're doing here, explore Stowe, her work, who intersected with her, really just thinking broadly about who Stowe was, her historical context, people like Martin Delany, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Jacobs, everyone that she was responding to and was responding to her, because we know that Stowe is not just writing and existing in a silo, right? She was part of this huge turmoil that was the 19th century. It's not, and we are, do you want to say it? Oh, my colleagues. We are especially thrilled to be welcoming Dr. Taya Miles as our keynote speaker at that symposium. So keep a lookout for more details coming soon on our website. We're still, of course, massaging the particulars, but I think there is a little bit of information up. There's going to be a lot more up on our website.
And my colleague Tyra just came up with a book on Harriet Tubman.
Yes.
So, but now we're down until April.
Yes.
Night flyer.
Book club.
Yeah, night flyer.
Book club.
And yes, so thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes, the recording will be up online relatively shortly.
And can we get signed, is that?
Oh, sure.
Making.
Yeah.
Right, and-
Yeah.
Awesome.